Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com.
Hi, this is Ron Fortier with another episode of the In Focus podcast, brought to you by the South Coast Insider. And we have another return guest. He is a veritable fountain of information because he's an intelligent person and also because he's experienced. And that
means I'm an old timer.
I was going to say because he's old like me. With that in mind, I'd like to welcome back Ralph Hickok. And Ralph, could you spell that for people just in case? Again, people traveling around, they want to scribble it down. They don't have access except for the sound.
Yeah, it's Hickok, and I spell it the same way Wild Bill did, Hickok.
Okay, very good. Thank you. The reason why I invited you back is seriously, the first time you were on the show, we were in pre-pandemic mode, and there were so many things that you touched upon. And I've always said from the very beginning that these podcasts are not a one and done, that everybody has much more of a story to tell. And then the analogy of not just a page, you're a chapter. In your case, you're a volume. And I'd like to focus on your time with the Standard Times and some of the interviews that you've done. And don't forget, when we're talking artists, in this particular case, we're speaking visual, performing, and literary artists. Right. So even within your own ranks, Earl J. Dias, for example, were you there when, was it Earl Wilson was there as well?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah. So with that in mind, let's, pick it up from there.
Yeah, the two Earls were both very interesting people. And I was in the Sunday department, and every Monday I spent virtually the whole day editing copy from syndicated columnists and from some of our local columnists. And both Earls almost always came in on Monday to deliver their columns, and they always hung around for a while and chatted. And Earl Wilson wrote a column called Remember, with a question mark, Remember. And he had been it was called the trolley car reporter. He'd get on the trolley in downtown New Bedford in the morning. He'd ride it over to Fairhaven. He'd go to town hall, the police department, fire department, pick up the news there, get back on the trolley, go to Mattapoisett, do the same thing. He'd go all the way to Wareham that way, and then he'd ride the trolley back to New Bedford and write his stories. And I don't know how many years he did that, but it was a long time. So he had a lot of memories.
Yeah.
And his column was always very interesting to me. I learned a lot from him.
So did he physically look at the police logs and extrapolate information from the logs?
Yeah, that was the way you did it in the old days. Even when I started the newspaper business, that's what you did.
Silly question. Did you guys have to know shorthand, or did you just scratch down a lot of things?
I knew my mother was a stenographer, had been a stenographer. She did teach me shorthand, but I really developed my own kind of shorthand through the years of interviewing people. And I also, I learned that if I really focused, I could remember stuff pretty well, and often I found taking notes kind of intrusive often. So with a lot of interviews, I just listened, intently, and then wrote notes and direct quotes immediately afterward. I had to do it right away, or it'd be all gone,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think every newspaper person developed some kind of shorthand. You had to.
Now you were on the paper at we could say it's heyday. You were there when Basil Brewer was there?
He was still the publisher in name, but he was non compos mentis at that time.
Okay.
Charlie Lewin really ran the
Okay.
operation at that time. I arrived in November of 1963.
Okay.
In fact, I left Ohio the day JFK was assassinated. And,
yeah.
that's a date I will always remember.
Just going back in your memory banks, and again, sticking to the arts, who was your most memorable, well, it doesn't have to be that you wrote the column, but your most memorable encounter, whether you were editing somebody else's story like Earl J. Dias or whatever?
Boy, that's a tough one. One of them might sound kind of offbeat. One guy I really enjoyed interviewing was Hans Conried, who was
Uncle Tanous.
Exactly, a man of many voices.
Yeah, Uncle Tanous of the Danny Thomas Show. For those of us, of you who.
Yeah, right now I remember him. I first knew him as Professor Kropotkin on a radio show called My Friend Irma, and interestingly enough, my father was a managing editor of the Pacific Stars and Stripes in Tokyo, in occupied Japan immediately after the war. And Hans Conried was a PR man for General Douglas MacArthur. So that my dad and Hans Conried knew one another. And he had a very interesting background. He had gone to Columbia University, and he in the early days of radio, they didn't give you credit. They didn't credit the actors. And he realized that if he could do a lot of different voices and accents, he could do several different roles on a radio show, and nobody would know, but he'd get paid, three or four times. So he mastered a whole bunch of accents, and he did a variety of voices too. And so it was really interesting interviewing him. He was at he was performing in a play at the Cape Playhouse when I interviewed him. So that was a really interesting experience.
Now for the local folks, and we've discussed this before. Part of the Artist Index, or the official title of the Artist Index website project, is to resurrect people from the past, people who at one time may have had a modicum of celebrity, and with their death, and then death of their family and anybody who knew them, they just faded from memory, faded from time. Anybody that you can recall that when you were on the paper, as a resident in the city, that was someone of note?
Well, you mentioned the other Earl Dias. Was really a fascinating guy, very, very bright guy, and a wide range of knowledge. Earl did a lot of reviews. He had started doing reviews for the Standard Times, I think, in the late 40s. And I saw at one point that he had written something like 5,000 reviews of plays, musical performances, art shows. I mean, he did everything. He knew music, he knew art, he knew literature. He was a real expert on Shakespeare. Something I think probably most people don't know about Earl is that he wrote a large number of one-act plays, basically for high school performers. And he had several collections out there. I have no idea if people still do that, but that was just one of the things he did. And Earl was a graduate of Bates College, and the Sunday editor, John Ackerman, had graduated just about the same time from Bowdoin College, and they were kind of rivals. So they kind of had some funny dialogues going when Earl came in.
If I remember John, he was a bit of a curmudgeon, or when he wanted to be.
Yeah, he could be. But he was a great guy to work with. We sat we were in kind of an odd position. He was Sunday editor, and I actually held two titles. I was assistant Sunday editor, and I was also editor of the Sunday magazine. So basically 2 days a week I was his boss, and 2 days a week he was my boss, which would have been a very difficult situation for a lot of people. But John and I never had any problems. He was, easygoing guy, and he pretty much let me do what I wanted. I decided what stories I'd write, and took the time to do them. So.
Now, you mentioned a Sunday magazine, which it's taking me off on another tangent. What was it called? Well, I remember the Southeasterner, the
Yeah, that's what it
Bowsprit.
was. Yeah, and it was also Panorama at one time.
Panorama.
And I'm not even sure what order they came in. It was Southeasterner when I took it over.
Yeah.
It had been kind of I don't quite want to say junkyard, but it was kind of a place where they threw photographs that there wasn't room for in the regular paper. So it was just kind of a hodgepodge of photographs, and with no real editor. I mean, John Ackerman kind of put it together, and with an artist, Rose Mello, but there was no continuity to it, basically. And so when I was given the position, my basic mission was to turn it into something that could be read, So it became a vehicle for long form stories with a lot of photos, illustrations.
Now, I think just around 88 is when, well, actually, one of the reasons for this whole project, Mary Jean Blasdale, who was the then curator of the Whaling Museum, the art curator of the Whaling Museum, she put an ad in. So in 88 I think it was probably the Bowsprit by that time.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I was only there. I left there in 73.
Okay.
And I guess it might have been, it probably was Bowsprit. Somewhere along the line, it turned into Panorama.
Okay, that's right. Yeah, you went to SEA Advertising, Southeast Advertising.
Yeah, right.
That's right. Yeah. Okay, well, that's a blind alley.
Yeah, I can't help you much there.
Yeah, so let's see. Prior to 73, I'm trying to think of any any of the folks of note that were wandering around the city.
Well, there was a lot of jazz going on at the time. I did a fair amount of writing about jazz, about local jazz groups. And it's interesting, there's a place, it used to be called the Crystal Cafe, and they had Cape Verdean music every Sunday afternoon. A friend of mine at the Standard Times, Elmer Rodericks, who was city editor, introduced me to the place. And it's interesting that the Cape Verdean music is basically jazz, and I think that's the reason why there have been so many outstanding Cape Verdean jazz musicians, starting with Horace Silver, whose real name was Horace Silva, probably the leading one, and the great sax player with Duke Ellington, Paul Gonsalves, was Cape Verdean. He's the guy. He's famous for having basically saved Ellington's orchestra with his. He played I believe it was the 1956 Jazz Festival. He played a 27 chorus solo, which had everybody up and clapping and dancing, and it kind of made Ellington famous again. And he immediately started to get more bookings at a time when he was just about ready to fold the orchestra because they weren't getting job offers. But there are a lot of local talent too. And,
I think I pretty much hit pay dirt with you on the jazz, because I've been told, for example, that at one time this city was, and then again, jazz circles aren't that wide.
Yeah, true.
Or, I guess they never really were. Sometimes it was probably a little murky, at best. And but that this city was well known amongst jazz aficionados, and that here's a fact. I hope I'm remembering it correctly. With Newport being so close, that the sailors would come into here and not for the reason you would assume sailors would come in here, but because of the jazz that a lot of them picked up their jazz habit, so to speak, in the service at that time.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. That would have been a little before my time, I think.
Mhm.
There was a place called the Piccadilly on Union Street, which had some
The
great.
Piccadilly Lounge?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It was basically in what is now the parking lot of Dunkin' Donuts down on Union Street behind the bank there.
Yeah, that's okay. It's across the street from Charles Ashley Insurance. Yeah, I know exactly where it is. Yeah.
So
Yeah. There was a dry cleaners on the corner.
Yeah, West End. Yeah, that was Henry Balistracci ran that West End Laundry, I think it was called.
Yeah. So a lot of the jazz, it seems, was fired up by the Cape Verdean community.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. And there was a terrific group out in New Bedford called Coleus one time, which was led by Bobby Green, who unfortunately died rather young of cancer, and some outstanding musicians in that group. There was a great bass player named Bill Brito who toured with Marion McPartland for some years, and just a lot of people,
There was also Armstead Christian. Was he associated with them?
No, Armstead was a little later than that.
Okay.
I'm not sure when he came to New Bedford, but yeah, he was a super talented guy. And in fact, his mother-in-law was a good friend of my wife's, and Eloise Pina.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and her daughter Marcy, who works at City Hall, was Armstead's wife. And yeah, Armstead was a major teacher at Berkeley, among other things. And,
that was a follow-up question that, from, again, what I understand, that New Bedford has been represented on the Berkeley faculty quite a bit and for quite a long time.
Yeah. There are quite a few people from down here have and still do teach there.
Mm-hmm. Gene Krupa, New Bedford native?
Oh, not that I know of. I really don't know.
Okay, that one I'm trying to get a handle on that. Unless I'm messing him up with another big time drummer, a person of a similar status. They used to run a program at Old Rochester Regional every summer. I believe it was every summer, and it was quite the thing for musicians in this area to play with him.
Oh yeah. Well, whether he's from this area, that still would have been a big deal.
Yeah. And then there was Nelson Eddy, who famously was coupled with Jeanette MacDonald. In the movies, was from here. But that's not jazz. Any other jazz recollections that you have?
Well, I went for a walk the other day. This is not jazz, strictly speaking, but I went for a walk down past the Roach Jones Duff House and took a little detour onto a little side street there called Joli Gonzalez Way, Memorial Way. Joli was not a jazz guy, but he was a remarkable performer, and he was basically an opera singer, opera type singer, a tremendous voice. And I met him very early in my Standard Times career. He was in a very serious car accident, and he couldn't do that kind of travel anymore. So he pretty much, performed locally. Mm-hmm. And did a lot of work with school kids, pretty much volunteer work, as I understand it. Just a really interesting man.
I had met him several times. I think he was one of the people that used to hang out at Jimmy's Steamy Dogs on Purchase Street. There was quite a hangout over there, and he was also a ball of energy. Oh my God! He was spun up all the time, but always in a positive way, very jovial and such.
Yeah, when the Olympia Theater was being torn down, I was going down there every so often to see the progress, if you can call demolition a progress, to do a story about it. And Jolie was down there too. So he told me that they had given him permission to take anything he wanted as a souvenir. So we were both down there one day, and he came over to me with this brass plate, maybe like 4 inches square, kind of serrated surface. And he said, "Do you know what this is?" And I said, "I have no idea." And he said, "There's one of these on the inside of each door in the theater." I said, "I still don't know." And he said, these were for men to scratch their safety matches on to light their cigars and cigarettes at intermission.
Really? Talking about theater fires, right?
And he said, I'm taking them all. That's a real souvenir.
Souvenir, yeah. That's pretty good. Let's see. Well, let's go back to '73. I guess there was still some of these speakeasy kind of places that still existed. The Bancroft Hotel, was that open when you were in town?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
Okay, they had a room up there. It was with hand painted murals, tropical kind of a theme to it, and it did look like a kind of a place that was legal, if you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah.
I've also heard that there's one that's still maybe there in Glazer Glass in their original building up on a third floor or whatever it is, in an attic space or whatever. But those kinds of places, with Prohibition, along came jazz as well. And any other recollections that you have of the jazz musicians, the jazz environment? And obviously, this is a brain-picking mission.
Yeah. Well, now there was a recording studio for a time called Stereophonics Inc., which was on Rivet Street, kind of kitty corner from the old Thomas's department store. It was on the second floor of I think maybe it was Macedo's Pharmacy at the time. I'm not sure.
Might have been there's a hardware store there now, I think.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But anyway, that I couldn't give you the exact years that it operated. But there was a guy named Carl German who was the sound engineer there. And Carl was a really exceptional man. He was a very good jazz guitarist, and he worked for Decca Records in a dual role. He was a studio guitarist for them, and he was also a record producer. And Carl, he was on call, so every so often Decca would give him a call, and at that time you could fly to New York, from New Bedford. And in fact, it's kind of funny with Carl. I first met him. He was playing guitar in a group with a Cape Cod jazz pianist named Marie Marcus. So I met Carl down there, and found out he was New Bedford. In fact, his brother Ralph German worked at the Standard Times. And then like 2 weeks later, I flew to New York. I had a literary agent at the time. I flew to New York to meet with my agent, and I was walking along 6th Avenue, and I run into Carl German. And so I said, "What are you doing here?" So then he told me about Decca Records. And then like 2 weeks after that, I get a call from a guy whose name I can't remember. And he told me, he's starting this Stereophonics Inc. and he wanted a story. So I went over to him, and there's Carl German again as the sound guy, But Carl was an amazing guy. I did a story about the place, and they were doing recordings of local rock groups at the time. So, this group came in like 6 guys, and Carl said, play something, play a few bars to give me a level, So they started playing, and all of a sudden Carl shouted on the mic, "Hey, bass player, your G string is a quarter tone flat."
Oh.
I mean, he was like that. But they recorded Bobby Hackett, the cornet trumpet player, and they recorded. Marion McPartland came up from New York to do a recording there. And then, as far as I know, those records were never released because they had a fire that wiped the whole thing out. But,
Oh, that's awful. That's awful.
I have my suspicions about that, but I won't voice them to you.
Yeah,
But then Carl, I believe, also worked. I think Metcalf Studios might have sort of been an offshoot of that, but
that was my next question.
Yeah, there are people who know a lot more about that than I do. Carl Simmons being one of them.
Yeah. Which, could you please convince him to be on the show? He's like a big fish for me, and I already. I think this is the second time I got him just up on the dock, and he's like slithered away or something. But he is like an enormous treasure trove of information. I have no idea how old he is. I don't think he's.
Carl went to high school with my son. I would say Carl's maybe 42.
Yeah.
42, 43. He was a year ahead of my oldest son, I believe. But yeah, he's amazing. He came over. In fact, he came over to visit me one time specifically to talk about Carl German and Metcalf Studios. And I think we spent like 3 or 4 hours just sitting,
wow,
about various aspects of New Bedford history and so forth. And yeah, he's an amazing young guy.
There was also, I think, one other recording studio in the area, and then again, that it's I don't know. Maybe this is a theme that's played out in a lot of cities where you have these professional recording studios. They're not visible to the public. They're known amongst the professionals, and the professionals can sort of like sneak in and sneak out of these cities, and do their thing without being bothered. I wonder about that.
Yeah, and I think I'm sure sometimes the cost is a lot lower than it would be in New York City, And it really doesn't matter where you do the recording, if they have facilities.
Yeah, as long as you have a good personnel handling it.
Yeah,
I know Fall River had Lane Poor. It wasn't a recording studio. He was the developer of the guitar pickup.
Oh, okay.
And he was at the forefront of developing the pickup for years. I went there. I got called in to do some advertising work for them. And the wall, I wonder if anybody ever tore out the wall and saved it. Every major rock band that you can think of that went there to have a custom-made pickup made by Lane Poor himself.
Wow.
They scrawl their names on the wall.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's cool.
Other forms of well, unless we've tapped you out on jazz.
Well, yeah. I covered the Newport Jazz Festival for 8 years every year, also the folk festival. Now there was quite a folk music scene in New Bedford too, with the Tri-Works Coffee House basically.
Hold on that thought. With the Tri-Works Coffee House, Paul Clayton. Does that ring a bell?
I've heard the name, but I don't. I don't really know much about him. Just a matter.
New Bedford native, became like one of those like Phil Oakes kind of performers. Only the cognoscenti know who they are, and the rest of the people have no idea. But the Tri-Works, was that already in business, so to speak, when you came into town, or?
No, I think it started again. They just had their 50th anniversary, so it would have started after I came here. I think I probably wrote the original story about its founding. Maggie Peirce was basically the founder, and when it started, it was down at the rectory of Pilgrim United Church, which is across from the church itself, and later on it moved to the Unitarian Church. And that was a very active group, a lot of terrific performers down there. I did a lot of stories there. I also performed there.
You did? Wait a minute. I don't know anything about this. What is?
Well, this is this is kind of an offbeat story, but at the Newport Jazz Festival in 1967, I ran into Joan Baez, whom I sort of knew because I'd heard her in her very early days when she was 18 at a place called, well, it was 47 Mount Auburn Street. I think it was called Club 47. And so I saw her at the Newport Jazz Folk Festival, and I went up to her and reminded her that I'd been there. And she said, there's a young man here. He's going to do a performance at a workshop tomorrow morning. His name is Arlo Guthrie. And you really ought to hear this performance. So I went there Saturday morning earlier than I would have otherwise. He was doing Alice's Restaurant. And then he did it in another setting. I can't remember quite what it was Saturday. And then he did it. He was like their closing act Sunday night. And so in the car on the way back to New Bedford, I had it going through my head. And I realized that I knew the monologue pretty well. Now, I'm not a singer and I'm not a guitar player, but I got a guy named Steve Slade, whose mother was the family living editor at the time. So I got Steve to play guitar for me, and I performed. I think I was probably the second person in the world to perform Alice's Restaurant.
Oh my God, that is a really interesting story. You just made the whole podcast here.
I actually did it first at the Standard Times. In the city room, and I was docked a day's pay for doing it.
Get out of here.
No, it's true. And
really?
Then I did it at TriWorks later on, and then I also did it for a local club. So I threatened to do it with my family every Thanksgiving, but nobody ever asked me to follow up.
They're gonna wish they did. They're gonna wish they did. The TriWorks was a true coffee house. I mean, can we say it was from the Beat generation, or with Maggie Pierce running it? Was it more the? I'm assuming she collaborated at some point with Howard Glasser from what was SMTI SMU.
Yeah, I don't know if they were ever involved together. Yeah, he did the Eistead Fund. He started the Eistead Fund out there. Yeah, Maggie, of course, is from Ireland and from Belfast, and she was a singer in her own right. And later on, I couldn't give you the exact years. It moved up to Unitarian Church, and then after a time, Maggie did it for a long time, and then a young woman named Margot Cherig, who worked at the Standard Times, kind of took over. And it flourished for a long time, and there were some really good local performers. One of the leaders was Barbara Carnes.
Barbara Carnes.
Yeah, she was a terrific, singer in that genre. And but a lot of local people. When
you said, for some reason I always thought Maggie was Scottish. But when you mentioned Ireland, we had another connection here in the city. Was Aoife
Clancy.
Clancy, yeah, I just blanked out on her father's name. Yeah. So again, the city continues to amaze by its connections to. God, it sounds like such an old-fashioned term, but to the outside world. It's amazing how many people of note, people of celebrity have stepped in here and left their marks, so to speak.
Now, speaking of Scotland, there was a guy named Johnny Cunningham. I don't know if you ever knew or was aware of him.
No.
John was considered just about the best Celtic fiddle player in the world. He was from Scotland. He came to the United States. He founded he was one of the founders of a group called Silly Wizard in Scotland, which is really credited with starting the Celtic revival. And he came to New York first. Didn't like New York very much. Tried the Boston scene. Didn't like that very much. And came down to New Bedford, and unfortunately he died of a heart attack when he was 46. But he was a tremendous performer, tremendous guy. He and I became good friends. Very, very funny guy. And he had a recording studio on I guess it was second story of his home at the corner of Clinton and Cottage Streets.
Really? South corner? What?
Yeah, it would have been the southeast corner. Yeah.
All right, so the southeast corner of Clinton and Cottage.
Yeah, it was Davenport Bed and Breakfast more recently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But,
yeah. Oh, the old neighborhood.
But John did a thing every year at what was then called Summerfest. He had a bunch of basically Celtic fiddle performers usually on his stage, but very, very talented. He could have been a stand-up comic.
Really?
He was a very funny guy.
Other venues, because now it's just going through my head. There's the Crystal Cafe, the Piccadilly Lounge. There were other venues that weren't exactly the rock music venues that started to sprout out in the 70s, just about the time when you went over to SEA.
Yeah,
Do you remember any of those?
Well, Jimmy Connors had a place called The Office, which he had a piano bar there, and he had a piano trio often performed. And he had a lot of jazz performers at the main event when he took that place over. Now, Bill Brito was one who performed there. Bill and his wife Carol, who was a piano player, both performed there, among many others.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he had a lot of local jazz performers in there. And for a while, the Paddock Pub, which is now the Pasta House, did a jam session every Sunday. One of the guys that comes to mind is a guy named Jimmy Lamba, who was a sax player. I was sitting in my office one morning, and Elmer Rodrigues, whom I've mentioned before, the city editor, came rushing in. He said, "Ralph, you've got to interview Jimmy Lamba." And I said, "Who's Jimmy Lamba?" And Elmer said, "He's a terrific sax player. He's been in California for years. He came back. I heard him perform last night. I told him that you'd give him a call. Here's his phone number." So I called Jimmy, went over. I figured I'd spend maybe an hour, hour and a half interview. I ended up, I got there like at 1:00, and I ended up eating dinner with Jimmy and his wife because he was such a fascinating interview. He had been with Dinah Washington. He'd been in her backup group, touring the country, and he was one of the people. He was one of the leaders, in fact, getting that jam session going on Sunday afternoons. Just a terrific guy, terrific musician, and a terrific person. And he was in a very bad auto accident performing on the Cape. And he told me, I went down to see him. He was in Cape Cod Hospital. He'd broken like 7 ribs or something. And he told me that the doctor told him that if he hadn't been a sax player, he'd be dead, but his lungs were so strong that the broken ribs could not puncture his lungs.
Really?
So he survived because he was a sax player.
Wow.
So then he returned. When he got out of the hospital, I went to visit him again. He was playing the flute, and I said, "I didn't know you could play the flute." And he said, "I'm just learning." So he decided in his spare time while he was recuperating, he'd learn the flute.
Yeah, it's a little smaller too, I guess. I'm going, trying to click back in time, and of course, a lot of this I was a kid with, following my dad around and such. But does anything jump into your head about Well, musicians at large. I mean, at one time there were a bunch of orchestras around here. There was Gilly Farrow. There was oh my God, I'm forgetting. There were a couple of really big orchestras, and then they ended up doing the wedding circuits before they just faded away.
Yeah, right.
Any of those ring a bell?
Yeah, I'm trying. What was the?
Ribeiro, I think, was one of them.
Yeah, there was a big one that actually, way back before my time, there was something called the Duke Oliver Orchestra, which I kept hearing a lot about, and that kind of became. Oh, I just can't think of the name of the group. I'm thinking Sundowners, but that's not right. Highlanders. It was something Ers.
Yeah.
And they even used to be in the parade. They were in the Cape Verdean parade every year. But it was a big band sound. But the numbers were dwindling. You could see if you went to that parade every year, you could see there were fewer and fewer musicians every year.
Yeah.
But I remember them performing on the library steps, when they were doing that jazz at lunchtime thing back, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, I guess.
Does Lionel Soares ring a bell? He was a clarinetist, and I know he played with several. He was a music instructor and a clarinetist, and he played with several groups.
No, I didn't know him.
Now, when you mentioned marching, parades and marching bands, back in the 60s, that's another genre of music. I mean, that they were, I hate to use the term, they were a dime a dozen. There was the Bay State Band, the Luso American Band, and it just went on and on and on. And some of them, as you talk about dwindling numbers, it's kind of sad, but they just like the last people who could stand and walk a mile and play. It was down to 2-3 guys.
Yeah. There was also a big drum and bugle corps thing going on. In fact, we ran a weekly column about the drum and bugle corps scene in New Bedford, which was written by a guy named Bob Kudo, who I have been told is now a priest.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but that was one of the things I edited every week, and I don't know whatever became of that. I don't know if such a thing as a drum and bugle corps even exists anymore.
Probably not. It's like anything else. It's all about cost.
Yeah.
You can't pay these people $25 for every appearance. It just doesn't fly. Some of the stories that you've edited, if you can remember any of them having to do with the arts, anything that jumps to mind.
Well,
I mean, it's got to be a lot of them. Not that I'm putting a pressure on you. What I'm saying, there has to be a lot to choose from. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, it was mostly Earl's column, really. Earl Dias, the stuff he wrote, and I'm trying to. When I think about it, I didn't do that much on the local scene. I was more likely to do somebody visiting, like Buddy Rich performed at Dartmouth High School, and I did a story about him, and he was quite a character. He came out at intermission, and he said, I've been told by the principal I have to tell you that no smoking is allowed on school grounds, but as far as I'm concerned, if you like it, smoke it. And
Buddy Rich, yeah, that rings a bell.
Great drummer, great drummer.
I'm wondering if maybe it was him. Maybe I'm getting him confused with Gene Krupa, because we've had a lot of. No, Gene Krupa was born in Chicago, so maybe it was Buddy Rich.
I think he's a New York guy, but he grew up in a theatrical family. He started playing drums professionally on stage when he was like 2 years old or something.
Yeah, there were just too many of them. I mean, we have a lot of other celebrities in here. Anthony Athanas, who was the owner operator of Anthony's Pier 3 in Boston.
Oh yeah.
And then, again, it's a huge list. I can't remember the woman's name. She was the choreographer for Gene Kelly. I think she helped.
Carol Haney.
Carol Haney.
Yeah, she taught my mother-in-law dance lessons. She was still in Carol Haney was still in high school at the time, and she was teaching dance. Yeah.
Now, there was a Mr. Haney who ran a flooring business out of the Wing department store. I'm wondering. I mean, there weren't that many Haneys. I'm supposing. I was just wondering if there was a connection there.
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't know what her local family was, but she became quite famous for a solo performance that she didn't perform an awful lot. She was more a choreographer and teacher. Mm-hmm. But she did a number which was a big hit on the Ed Sullivan Show called Steam Heat, which is from the Pajama Game, which she didn't star in it. It was a secondary role, but she was outstanding in it. And she died quite young. I believe she's buried in Marion. But she was. She was in another fairly big movie. It was one about the three sailors who come to town and meet three dancers or something. But yeah, she worked with Gene Kelly.
Carol Haney?
Yes. Haney.
Oh, somebody once said, "God bless the Google." I think that was the former president that said that.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was born in New Bedford in 1924. She died in Saddle River, New Jersey in 64. And the Pajama Game. Oh my God, she's Doris Day and Company, Broadway songs, hits, and shows. It just goes on. She obviously had a pretty darn good career while it lasted. Now you've been well traveled. Is there anything about this area that makes it? And again, it's an opinion. As a creative community, you think we're as average as any other city's creative community? Or are we on par? Are we above average? Or
I'd say at least in terms of visual arts, I'd say definitely above average. I don't think there's any question about it. I worked in Gloucester, the Gloucester Daily Times. It's my first real non-college job, so to speak. And of course, they had quite an art community over in Rockport, where I live, Bearskin Neck. But and it was pretty much celebrated community. It was pretty well known. People came there to paint motif number one, among other things. But I think New Bedford's art community at this point far outweighs what Rockport had at that time. I think there's no doubt about it.
What do you think is the cause of that? And I've had several opinions.
Well, I say Swain School is really the root of it. I've been amazed. I talked some years ago. There was a young woman exhibiting at Gallery 65, which unfortunately is no longer there. But I chatted with her for a while, and it turned out she was from, I think, Illinois originally. So I said, well, how'd you get to New Bedford? And she said, well, I was considering two art schools, one in San Francisco and Swain School. And when I came here and David Smith interviewed me, she said 5 minutes into the interview, I knew I had to go to Swain School. And I think really that's really the root of it all, Ron, I think.
Yeah.
And the building we live in, it's an apartment building, and we've had a lot of Swain School, now UMD students in here, and of course the UMD art program is basically Swain School, really.
Mm-hmm.
And but we went to a place called Scargo Pottery down on the Cape one time, and it's a guy named Henry Hole who was a great what is ceramicist a word? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, it is a word. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
But he,
Potter.
yeah. But he had four daughters who after his death, his four daughters were running the place, and it's really an amazing place. It's on Route 6A, and there's a lot of outdoor pottery castles and stuff.
Mhm.
And so we went down there like in April one year when it was just reopening, and one of his daughters was there. So got chatting with her, and I said, we're from New Bedford, and she said, "Oh, I went to Swain School." I said, "Oh, wow." A lot of connections going on.
Yeah, its
But yeah,
roots.
but of course, there, there before Swain School, there were, there was William Bradford and Bierstadt and Ryder, and so
Oh,
it started before Swain School, but I'm sure Swain
yeah.
really carried it on.
Can you think of another community similar to New Bedford in that regard?
Well, again, my experience is rather limited. I'd say I don't know what the Rockport art scene is like now. I was there about 1960, and there was a lot going on, but it was really a summer thing. It that scene just kind of died once the summer season ended. It was kind of like
Yeah,
the Cape. These
right.
people arrived in June and they were gone in mid-September.
Yeah,
And here it's really year round here. It
yeah.
doesn't stop.
It was kind of commercial too. I mean, um, it played to the tourist trade.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
I don't want to demean anybody just based on memory or whatever, but um, that's where you went to get a painting of a quaint New England town, and motif number
Oh
one,
yeah.
which
Oh yeah. No
became
question.
that motif number one is probably similar to was it the Red Barn in Vermont?
Right there you go.
The most painted the most painted structure ever, and the most photographed structure ever. And I guess they just both happen to be red.
Yeah. Well, I happen to have two paintings. Well, actually, a painting and a lithograph of motif number one. One was done by a very good artist named Harold Rotenberg, uh, whom I got to know when I was up there, and the other was done by my wife's grandmother. So
Yeah,
that's motif number one
yeah,
in
yeah,
a
yeah,
nutshell.
yeah.
And, but yeah, really, it was kind of like the Cape. The Cape has a big art thing going on during the summer, but
Right. I mean,
and
P-Town.
there's certainly some year-round people that
Right.
work down there. But
P-Town became a regional force. I mean, it was the Hans Hofmann and the whole Cape Cod School and Edward Hopper and that kind of thing. It's always kind of intrigued me how certain places, for whatever reason, stimulate this kind of environment.
yeah,
You know.
well, certainly the scenery has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, yeah.
You can't beat the seacoast for you know,
That's the
if you're a representational painter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Ralph, thank you so much. I would like to pick your brain as often as possible. You just gave me an enormous amount of information here that I can go scurrying after and getting more information on. And again, if there's ever anything that you wake up in the middle of the night and go, "Oh, damn," please, because you might be the only person that remembers that, and that's I say part and parcel, but it's pretty much the whole enchilada. That when you go, as we all are going to have to shuffle off to Buffalo, so to speak. All those memories go with you, and along with the memories are life itself.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, Ron. I think it's kind of ironic because for so much of my career, I was the youngest guy. I was always the youngest this and the youngest that.
Yeah,
And now all of a sudden it's tomorrow, and now I'm the oldest guy.
yeah,
but but I don't mind that. But yeah, I have thought a lot about how like just the history of the Standard Times is I don't know how many people really know the history of the Standard Times, and I can't say that I do, but I
Yeah.
know a lot about it. And but anyway,
Yeah, no, again, it's just that's what keeps us young. Like constantly stimulating those gray cells and keeping us moving forward. And one more question. What is the most memorable thing in the arts that you have ever witnessed in this city, or in this area?
I think AHA Night is one of the biggest things that's ever happened to New Bedford. It's an amazing institution, and I can say it's been, I think, 20 years now. It's definitely an institution.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's one of the very best things that's ever happened to this area. Another one that comes to mind, if I'm allowed to mention too, was the exhibit of the whaling panorama at Kilburn Mill. That was just an outstanding event. And I think it's one of the very best things that the Whaling Museum has ever done, and in terms of connecting with the community and getting a lot of people involved in knowing what the Whaling Museum is and what New Bedford is for that.
Yeah.
That was an amazing event. I went there 3 times.
3 times.
Yeah.
This is Ron Fortier again, signing off and thanking our guest, Ralph Hickok, for another great episode on the Artist Index and the In Focus podcast. And until the next time, thank you so much.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be the artist you believe you are, and let's take care of each other out there.